America has grown at over 20.5% a year since 2000. Trade with Asia now accounts for 21% of Latin America's international trade. By comparison, trade with the United States accounts for more, for 34%. And there is indeed much skepticism about what these trade links mean. Is the demand in Asia for Latin America's minerals, energy resources, and agricultural products driving out industry and leading to a form of deindustrialization? The UN Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, CEPAL, as well as the World Bank, have become more outspoken about the dangers as well as the benefits of the commodity boom. But what gathers us here today is an interest in a broader reflection on the direction, the pace, the quality of the economic as well as political relationships between Asia and the countries of Latin America. A great deal of work has been done on Latin America's relationship with China. In fact, joining us today are some of the region's pioneers in studying and seeking to shape the nature of those ties. And I mentioned Cynthia Sanborn from Peru, Enrique Dussel from Mexico, who have produced an extraordinarily large body of work on this relationship. But what we're trying to do now is to expand the boundaries of that inquiry, emphasizing not only China, but also the lesser explored relationships with countries such as South Korea, India, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, and Vietnam. What are the contours and the implications of trade and investment policy? And is there a strategic vision that guides the political and diplomatic as well as commercial relationship? And what do the deepening ties between Asia and Latin America suggest for the possibility of closer coordination and cooperation on global governance issues? I am honored to welcome back to the Wilson Center the Honorable Luis Alberto Moreno, the President of the Inter-American Development Bank, who will deliver the keynote address. As President of the IDB, Ambassador Moreno serves as Chairman of the Board and Executive Director of the Inter-American Investment Corporation, and also as Chairman of the Donors Committee of the Multilateral Investment Fund. And as many of you who have been in Washington know, for many years, for 7 years, Ambassador Moreno served with distinction as Colombia's ambassador to the United States during and through the process of implementation of Plan Colombia. Throughout his career, Ambassador Moreno has received some of the highest distinctions given by the Colombian state. He has a BA from Florida Atlantic University, an MBA from the School of International Management at Thunderbird University, and has also been awarded a Nieman Fellowship by Harvard University. Ambassador Moreno, welcome. Thank you. We look forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Cynthia, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and certainly a fascinating moment to consider the growing links that exist between Latin America and Asia. We all know that last month, the leaders of the most important countries in the world, China and the United States, not only visited and met here in the United States, but also both went to both Latin America and the Caribbean. China's President Xi, as you know, visited Mexico, Costa Rica, and Trinidad and Tobago, where he met with a number of Caribbean leaders. I think that shows the strategic importance of the region, and more importantly, the connections to an Asia that is hungry for resources and is eager every day more to build strong ties in investment, in trade, and in diplomatic fora. Vice President Biden was also in Brazil, in Colombia, as well as in Trinidad and Tobago, following, as you all know, this trip 1 month earlier that was also done by President Obama to both Mexico and Costa Rica. So, you know, in this context, we know that the economies of Latin America and the Caribbean will grow this year close to 3.5%. That's about 3 times the pace of the developed world. We have the natural resources that China needs and the avid consumers that U.S. exporters want to tap on. So U.S. exports, as Cynthia was saying, to Latin America have more than doubled since 2000 to become a record of $400 billion last year, thanks in part to the many free trade agreements that the U.S. has and the new ones that were included, those of Peru, Panama, and Colombia. Last year, we we in Latin America were home to 26% of U.S. exports, an increase of about 22% from the year 2000. The U.S. nearly exports 4 times as much to Latin America as it does to China. And this is a fact that people sometimes forget. But clearly, trade between Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean has, as Cynthia mentioned, been growing faster at an annual rate of 20% since the year 2000, and it reached close to $500 billion last year. Asia today accounts for an unprecedented 21% of Latin America's total trade, and if current trends continue, in 4 years, Asia will be the region's most important trading partner. China already is the top trading partner of Brazil, Chile, and Peru, and the second biggest partner for Colombia. We are 2 of the world's fastest growing regions, with dynamic, with outward-looking economies, and as the rest of the world has slumped, Asia and Latin America continue to prosper and increasingly have done and continue to do businesses together. In fact, we've done a number of analyses from our economists that show that the business cycle in Asia increasingly corresponds closer to the business cycle of South America. Now, the story of Asia and Latin America is familiar to many of you, that of fast-growing trade and investment. And we're here today to discuss how countries throughout Latin America and the Caribbean are trying to make the best of this opportunity, how to tap new markets, and to sustain the region's economic growth and equitable development. I like, therefore, today to explore 2 additional facets of this unfolding Asia-Latin America story. First, something that I think is out there sometimes, but is something that we attribute a lot of importance, is the growing convergence of labor costs and other factors that could have a positive impact on Latin America's ability to increase its own exports of manufactured goods. And secondly, how the rising middle classes pose significant challenges to policymakers in both regions, and how those challenges offer Asia and Latin America an unprecedented opportunity to cooperate and to look and to understand a set of solutions. A decade ago, there was a great concern over the future of manufacturing in Latin America. Hundreds of maquiladoras and factory assembly lines moved to Asia, especially to China, where wages were much lower. This was particularly true for Mexico, where hourly wages then were around 3 times the wages of China. Last year, according to many analysts, Mexico's average manufacturing wages began to converge with those of China. And I think it's safe to say that a few years ago, few of us imagined that Chinese wages would rise so quickly. And this creates, of course, an opportunity for manufacturers in Latin America. In fact, the rises of real wages in general in Asia have been faster than the rises in real wages in Latin America. Now, when you add the cost of transportation and logistics, that certainly makes the Latin American markets more attractive as a manufacturing base. This narrowing of the wage gaps is not enough to tip the scales in our favor, of course, and this is a very important point. Because to compete effectively with Asian manufacturing, Latin Americans will need to become more competitive in other areas as well. And that means larger investments in modernizing transport, logistics, and energy infrastructure, and especially energy costs, where Asia is far ahead of Latin America in many regards. So to put this in perspective, the average capital stock per worker in Latin America is around $41,000. And here what I'm referring to is the accumulated investments in roads, in power plants, and all other forms of infrastructure. Now that same figure for industrialized countries is around $220,000 per worker, and in Singapore, it's more than $240,000 per worker. Therefore, Asia has become, and will continue to become, a benchmark for Latin America, a benchmark on which Latin Americans have to look at when it comes to infrastructure investment, and in other investments in certainly, and successes in education, for instance. But in order to compete, Latin America will also have to make radical improvements to human capital, education, reduce informality, a huge challenge for many Latin American economies, and the informality, of course, I'm talking here in the workforce, and improves productivity across the board. We believe at the IDB that this is the single most important area that Latin America needs to advance on. We have, therefore, a long way to go on these fronts, but this picture is improving. For instance, Mexican automobile manufacturers are now considered amongst the world's most efficient and productive. In fact, Mexico jumped from being the world's 9th biggest car exporter to being number 4 in the last 6 years. And as a result, Asian firms are increasingly opening factories in this hemisphere to take advantage of trade agreements that provide duty-free access to the world's largest consumer market, that of the United States, and not to mention, but a very important, fast-growing middle class throughout Latin America is making Latin America a very important consumer market. Recent examples include the Chinese auto manufacturer Chery, which is opening assembly plants in Uruguay and in Brazil, and the Great Wall Company, which is building an auto plant in Venezuela. Japanese and Korean firms such as Honda or Samsung have long manufactured everything from automobiles to television sets and refrigerators in countries such as Mexico and or Brazil. And as more regional trade agreements are signed, such as the Pacific Alliance, that decision looks even smarter. As Latin America becomes increasingly attractive as a consumer market and a manufacturing hub for Asian firms, and as we realize that it makes sense to tap into Asia's dynamism to boost our own exports, the two regions are engaging as never before. Over the past decade, we have seen an unprecedented number of free trade agreements, 24 of them approved between countries of the two regions, another 6 of them under negotiation, including the groundbreaking Trans-Pacific Partnership, and 11 more that are being contemplated. Trade costs between the two regions are still too high, but as these agreements take effect, tariff and non-tariff barriers are coming down. And while it is true that trade between Asia and Latin America continues to reflect the traditional exchange of commodities for manufactured goods, we're starting to see changes there as well, as the region's companies become integrated into multinational global supply chains. And here, there is a big change taking place in those global supply chains. Latin America's homegrown multilatinas are also responsible for this shift toward higher value-added exports. Last year, we published a report entitled Pathways to China, the story of Latin American firms in the Chinese market. This report profiled more than 80 Latin American firms, from Brazil's Embraer to Mexico's Softec, which are selling goods and services as diverse as aircraft and information technology in China. In that same study, we showed that companies from our region have invested less than $900 million in China since 2006, which is therefore less than 1% of the total investment of companies and corporates outside of Latin America abroad. In other words, investments abroad. Trade between Asia and Latin America also remains too concentrated in a small number of countries. China, Japan, Korea, and India account for nearly 90% of Asia's trade with Latin America. And Brazil, Mexico, Chile, and Argentina account for nearly 80% of Latin America's trade with Asia. So with time, however, that too will change, especially as smaller countries bet on Asia to boost their exports. And this is the case of Costa Rica when it signed a free trade agreement with China back in 2011. So that brings me to the second point that I mentioned at the beginning. And despite their political and cultural differences, Asia and Latin America will face strikingly similar challenges in the years ahead. Over the past decade, Asia and Latin America have dramatically reduced the number of people living in poverty, propelling hundreds of millions into the middle classes. With rising incomes come, of course, rising expectations. And this is a very positive and significant development. Consider what we're seeing in the news. You all have seen in recent days the unprecedented protest in Brazil. These protests should not be confused with those taking place in recent years throughout the Middle East. After all, as we all know, Brazil is a mature democracy with a president who enjoys historical approval ratings. But instead, I think these protests are about the changing expectations of Brazil's rapidly growing middle class, which has increased by more than 40 million people over the past decade. And as many observers have already pointed out, these citizens, like their counterparts in Asia and in other emerging economies, today expect more from their government. They want quality education and better healthcare. They want better jobs, and they want better access to credit. And they want cleaner, safer cities, less congestion, and better public transportation. In sum, they want better public services. In Asia, these same kinds of expectations are leading citizens to engage in environmental activism or in protests against forced migration from rural areas to cities. I'm sure many of you saw last week's New York Times article describing China's plans to move 250 million rural residents into new urban communities over the next 12 years, a massive, challenging, and risky undertaking. It is part of China's efforts to boost growth through domestic consumption and to reduce its dependence on export-related growth. But as Latin America learned during its own process of rapid urbanization over the past 30 years, the result often can be that of crowded slums and the creation of a permanent underclass. And this is a new reality that Asia and Latin America have in common. As we all know, engagement between Asia and Latin America today goes far beyond trade and investment. The two regions have become strategically important to each other, and not just because they supply each other with needed commodities or manufactured goods, markets, and investment. Now more than ever, we need to tap each other's expertise in handling the complex development challenges that both regions face. We at the Inter-American Development Bank, in close collaboration with the Asia Development Bank, are doing our work precisely to support these efforts in helping, as a helping hand across the Pacific to share the lessons that we have learned. And this is part of the study that Cynthia was just mentioning to you earlier on. We have established a South-South cooperation agreement to help our member countries in both regions deal with complex issues such as regional integration, infrastructure, renewable energies, climate change, and institutional developments and social policy. That is precisely the scope of the study that we have here for you called Shaping the Future, which is an ambitious effort to spell out the dimensions of this deepening partnership between the two regions and help to outline ways that we can learn from each other's experiences. Latin America has much to learn from Asia's world-class education systems, high levels of innovation of science and technology, and the creation of global and regional supply chains. Asia could also benefit from studying Latin Americans' experiences in poverty reduction and social safety nets, agricultural productivity practices, and the promotion of sustainable cities. This knowledge sharing is at the very top of our own agenda. Just one example. In April of this year, several IDB specialists traveled to Manila to share with their ADB, the Asia Development Bank's counterparts, insights, for instance, on conditional cash transfers, which were pioneered, as we all know, in Mexico and in Brazil, and now have spread over 18 countries throughout the region. Another program that we're certain will be of great interest to Asian policymakers is the Emerging and Sustainable Cities Initiative launched by the IDB 3 years ago. We're working with mayors in more than 24 of these medium-sized cities to set a new standard for sustainable growth in urban areas. We help them evaluate land use, the quality of housing, public transport, traffic congestion, public security, and competitiveness. And we help them come up with solutions for pollution, for water supplies, for climate change, and natural disasters, as well as fiscal sustainability. Governments in Latin America and the Caribbean count on us to help them come up with the solutions like this to the challenges they face as our region grows, and increasingly, we will be sharing these solutions with our partners in Asia. Long ago, we learned that it's not enough to simply pursue growth at any cost. It is critical to find ways to promote economic growth that is inclusive, that is environmentally friendly, and that is sustainable. So it is the rising middle classes of Asia and Latin America that will accept nothing less than just that. with that, I'd like to close and thank you all for listening, and thank you for this invitation, Cynthia. And I think as we had here 2 years ago, this big study that we launched on is the next big thing for Latin America, India. I think more and more, especially as you look at the other ASEAN countries, you will find that these routes of trade will grow. As we remember that, during the Spanish conquista, the so-called viceroy of the New Spain had the Philippines as a capitanía. And we remember having the galleons coming with silk from Mexico, from Philippines to Mexico, and the spices going back. So this is a trade that has been there in time, and I'm sure will only grow with time. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Okay. Well, thank you for those outstanding remarks that I think set the framework for the conversation that we'll have throughout the morning. I'd like to ask people if they have questions or comments. Please wait for the microphone and identify yourself. I'll start with Dan Erickson from the State Department.
Thank you. This is on, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first, thanks for your remarks. They were fantastic. I had two questions for you. The first was that there's this kind of emerging analysis of the trade patterns in South America that says there's kind of two models emerging. The Pacific Alliance includes one set of countries, and then you have Mercosur on the other side, which is also looking to expand. And I don't think there's any country that's a member of both yet. And I was wondering how you kind of saw that dynamic unfolding. Are there actually two distinct models taking place there? Do you think that this could be, merged at some point in the future? And then the second question was, you mentioned the Pacific Alliance and also Trans-Pacific Partnership. And of course, in a lot of ways, the Pacific Alliance is very, I think, useful and very convergent with TPP. But there are some countries that are in the Pacific Alliance and not in TPP. Colombia, of course, and Costa Rica. And so I also want your perspective on how you see that being reconciled as the TPP negotiations move forward. Thank you.
Maybe what we can do is,
We got
because
a couple
we
of
have,
questions,
yeah,
yeah.
we'll take a couple other questions. We'll take Enrique, then in the back of the room. Por favor.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. Following with the question, in your opinion, what would be the institutional framework to discuss this Latin America, Caribbean, and Asian trade and investment discussion? Because in a 30 by 30 matrix, a little bit, regarding the countries on both sides, this is very difficult, not to say impossible, A, and B, does it make any sense to discuss this complex trade and investment relationship in terms of only TPP or only Alianza del Pacífico, etc.? Or what are your guidelines or ideas in this sense? No, thank you.
Back here.
Mike Macetic, the PBS Online NewsHour. You mentioned human capital and specifically education. One factoid that I've heard several times is that Singapore, with a population of 5 million people, sends more kids to Harvard than all of Latin America. What are some of the specific programs that you're pushing to try and equalize Latin American education with that in Singapore and South Korea and places like that?
Okay, and we'll take one final question down here.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned
Carlos, if you could introduce yourself too. Just introduce yourself.
Carlos Portales from American University. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned the China program on urbanization for the next year, and my question will be, how do you see the sustainability of demand from Asia? Because while there have been a lot of efforts in Latin America to make bridges with Asia, but mainly what changed was the growth of China and growth of Asia and the demand. Up to now, well, we have seen that China is going a little bit down and there was some concern in the region, but what will be the effect of this urbanization program in terms of the sustainability? And that could be a good news for the region.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So let's begin with Richard on TPP and the alliance of the Pacific and this notion that there is kind of two. Certainly, Mercosur is less ambitious in terms of trade than the Pacific Alliance. As you know, there's a lot of managed trade in Mercosur on sectors, for instance, automobile sector being one of them. You know, I do believe that what's interesting about the Pacific Alliance is that this was a meeting of the minds of countries. This didn't happen because anybody imposed it. It was just a natural evolution who had been there of countries that realized two things. One is that to grow, their size of their trade has to be bigger. There are countries like Chile, like Colombia and Peru, which are not big enough on their own, and they need to trade more with the world. And that they're located in the region of the world that has the biggest growth area in trade, which is Trans-Pacific. And I think this began this conversation, and it's the level of ambition, the level of commitment that basically speaks to a lot of the thinking in those countries. You've seen changes in governments in Peru, changes in government in Mexico, and that has not altered the speed with which countries have embarked on this alliance. In fact, as you know, actually, this coming week they have a big event in New York about how they will be integrating their stock markets. There's a big work that is being undertaken here that we have been participating actually to look at how stock markets throughout the region can be integrated. And I think if you begin to integrate capital markets will be a very important development. This, of course, requires regulatory convergence, a lot of work on tax issues. But at the end, you know, you have a level of savings, certainly not that of Asia, but 20% of savings in Latin America that is not being utilized for our own needs. And I think this is a very important aspect of development. It is true that some of the countries in the Pacific Alliance, I mean, you have already the 4 countries that were the initial founders, but already Costa Rica and Guatemala are close to becoming members. And eventually, probably other Central Americas countries will follow suit. Will they kind of get into a bigger picture with the TPP is one possibility. Will there be a negotiation with, say, a country of the size of Brazil to being here? I think that's the big question. And I think there's a lot of discussion going on this. And the spirit with which the alliance has been put together is a very open one. In other words, this is not an exclusive club. It's rather a set of standards that is agreed upon, but that is very ambitious in the way that it's ready to accept other members. So I think this is a work in progress. But I think, certainly in my view, one of the more attractive trade initiatives that we've seen in a long time. In terms of Enrique's question of the institutionality, some of the interesting things that the Pacific Alliance has done is to think that no one country can go to all of these different Asian markets with their own embassies and their own independent kind of trade and investment formulation, but rather go together. And I think that's interesting in that gives it a stronger presence. And they've begun to do that in some countries in Africa and actually some countries in Asia as well. I think that's a good model because, of course, you know, take for instance the so-called ASEAN countries. In population, they are almost double the total population of the Pacific Alliance countries. In terms of GDP, they're about half. And in terms of trade, they're not more than 1%. So here you have a huge opportunity. You know, when I'm talking here Indonesia, I'm talking Thailand, Malaysia, of course, the Philippines. These are all countries that have very little trade with the rest of Latin America, and in this case with the Pacific Alliance countries. So I think there's a lot of possibilities in those countries that we have, you know, this very big ocean that divides us, but very little in terms of connectivity. But there's a lot of interest on both sides. So what is the formulation? The way we've approached it is to use the institutionality that exists from the development perspective through the Asia Development Bank and the IDB. And we are doing a lot of work on areas like innovation, like transport and logistics, like the social policies, as I was saying before, on the conditional cash transfers. What we've done in the work with sustainable cities and the processes of urbanization, and the informal market. Some of the challenges on development on both sides of the Pacific, and it's been very interesting. We've created a lot of meetings between ministers from both sides, and I think this is something that we've created in an ad hoc basis, but certainly that shareholders from both institutions like that we're doing precisely that. So that's kind of another avenue of doing just that. In terms of the question on education and human capital, one of the fascinating revolutions is these online courses that are taking place, what Harvard, MIT, and Stanford started about a year ago. I was looking at some statistics. Some courses, some MIT courses, derivatives or something other, very complex things, had in the first day something like 150,000 students. And Colombia, for instance, was the 4th country in terms of usage of those courses, which happened to be, by the way, I think, for the most part today, continuing education. We've done things with Khan Academy, for instance, in schools in Peru, which has been amazing, the kinds of impacts these online courses are beginning to have. And I was just in an event that we did this past Monday in Colombia about how Latin American ministries of education and in general the discussion around education on uses of technology as a way to raise the standards of education. And there's a tremendous interest on that, on experimentation, but more importantly, how the business sector is getting more and more involved in worrying about the quality of education and the quality of students that schools in Latin America are producing. I'll give you a fact. Manpower does research constantly about voids and lacks of talent. 50% of Latin American businesses today say that they have a hard time filling the kinds of technical jobs that they need. And this speaks to a talent void that we're starting to see as we basically have a situation where manufacturing becomes more and more sophisticated and you don't have the numbers of IT specialists or engineers to serve those jobs. So this is going to become an ever-increasing area of concern, and certainly one where the U.S. has one of the biggest soft powers there is your higher education, which is extremely good, and something else that few people talk about is your community colleges to basically address some of the basic skills that people need, especially in certain areas of Latin America. So I think those are areas where the U.S. could do a lot more. Carlos's question on urbanization. We all know that Latin America is perhaps the most urbanized region of the world after North America. 80% of Latin Americans live in cities. And we all know the stories of what has happened. Here, certainly, the demands on steel, on cement, etc., that China and India, India has 70% of its population in rural areas. So as those cities are built, these demands of these commodities will be high for still a long period of time. China today is 51% urbanized, 49% rural. So all these huge cities will emerge in the next 20 or 30 years. The interesting thing is how they are done and how they are done with the kind of sustainability especially that you need. And it's not just environmental sustainability. It's fiscal sustainability to address the many challenges cities will have. And it is also about urban planning. But more importantly, more and more is how regions are organized, how all of us, groups of cities become a very important economic hub, how they are planned for the future. And this is kind of the interesting combination of experiences that we see across Asia and Latin America. Let me give you an example. We took, we concentrated on saying what's happening in the urban areas in Latin America. And we found the following. It's a fascinating work that we did over a long period of time. The mega cities, the Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, Rio, Mexico City, are cities that are basically tapering off in terms of growth. Their growth is basically stalled. So then we looked at other types of cities, and we found 500 cities with populations anywhere from 500,000 to 2 million people. And out of those, about 150 are doubling in size every 20 years. Why? Because they're either close to a big transport hub or an agricultural mining hub. And therefore, it is in those cities that we still have an option to begin to do the kind of planning from all these perspectives that will create sustainable cities that can be competitive. Because I think in the future, and how we create competitiveness in kind of the new kinds of industrial policies that we need to think of, is precisely in cities where you can bring industries, where you can create a good living environment, where you can have the kind of quality education and combine these things to really raise the productivity of cities. Some of the things that you have seen that are natural in this country or in Europe. These are the kinds of thinking that we believe we have to insert, and we developed a set of benchmarks and diagnostics with McKinsey and others, where we evaluate close to 150 indicators. And currently, we have 25 cities in Latin America where we're actually doing this work. It requires a lot of investment on the side of the bank and a lot of commitment of the city and the society in that city for the long period of time. And it's fascinating to see the profound changes that you're seeing there.
I actually think we're out of time. Perhaps I'll allow one last question from Lou Goodman. So if he could have the microphone. Lou Goodman, the former dean of the School of International Service at AU.
Yeah, thank you so much for your remarks. I mean, they were very impressive and comprehensive. One other thing, or another way of putting it, that Latin America and Asia have in common is they're both striving to stay out of the middle income trap. And Latin America has been in the middle income trap for some time. And when I hear Asian leaders talk about how to stay out of the middle income trap, they give really visionary statements about what they're going to do. Like President Park, when she was here last week, she talked about creating a Silicon Valley, a new Silicon Valley in Korea that would surpass what we have in California. And in Singapore, they talk about bringing 1.5 million more people to their country on top of the 5 million. When you describe what's happening in Latin America, it sounds like it's sort of going along with the trends. More countries, more products, not the same kind of grandiose vision, strong, clear vision that's articulated by Asian leaders. Is this just a different regional style, or are Latin American leaders going to articulate those kinds of visions at some point in time, and does this make a difference?
Look, this is a very important question. The biggest debate on the middle income trap in Latin America probably today is in Chile. Why? Because it's the country getting closer precisely to the top of the trap, let's say. And they've been very aggressive in setting a stage of saying we want to be in 10 years over $20,000 of income per capita. I think it's two stages of development. Look at, for instance, the kinds of challenges Latin America has vis-a-vis Asia to get there. 50% of the labor markets are informal. I mean, you won't get to the problems of middle income trap in the way Asia is unless you are able to resolve that. Secondly, what they've been able to do in innovation, which largely depends on the penetration, for instance, of bandwidth. We estimate, for instance, that for every 10% of increase in investments in bandwidth, you get something like 3.5% increases in productivity. And this is something that is happening very aggressively in all countries in Latin America. And it's something really that happened over the last 3 or 4 years, and we've actually created a whole division in the bank just to help countries on that space. So for the kind of innovation that you're speaking about, you really need to build up, of course, also the high quality university systems, have things like what Mexico's been able to do, and I think to a large degree thanks to NAFTA, is the huge number of engineers Mexico graduates today. By comparison, probably a larger number than those in the United States. So I think that's one of the differences. And of course, certainly the kinds of natural resources Latin America has are not as rich, of course, in Asia. That doesn't mean, on all this discussion, are we basically going back? Well, the reality is that countries like Australia or New Zealand were able to use natural resources as a way to move up. You know well, probably many of you don't know, but there's a study that was done by the World Bank that looked at 60 years of close to 130 countries and how many of those countries were able to move out of the middle income trap. And there were only, I think, 11 or 13, of which included countries like Greece, like South Korea, like Spain and Portugal. So there's not many countries that have been able to move out of that middle income trap. And I think what those countries used as a way to get out of the middle income trap is going to be different than the countries we have now. And part of the answer, I think, also is in regional trade. We trade a third amongst ourselves as compared, say, to Europe. European countries trade 60+% amongst themselves. We don't even get to 20%. We're probably anywhere from 18 to 20%. So this is a big area that we need to develop. I think the Pacific Alliance is part of the answer how to get there. And we need to start to think of creating these bigger trading blocks, which will help, you know, the whole system of global value chains, which I think is part of the answer to get to you. But I don't think there is an equal kind of approach by countries on this. It is more an aspirational one. And the other thing is the whole innovation agenda. Countries more and more are thinking how to create, you know, it's easy to talk about an innovation agenda. It's another thing to create the ecosystem where that innovation happens. And I think, again, these are the kinds of things countries are all doing in different ways.
Please join me in thanking Luis Alberto once again for the wonderful presentation.